Good morning. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's CMAP Talks, Complete Streets, Safe by Design. My name is Vicki Jacobson, and I'm a transportation planner here at CMAP. I will be moderating today's webinar, but before we begin, there are a few housekeeping items we want to address. Next slide, please. We have enabled closed captioning for this webinar. Attendees are in listen-only mode. If you have questions for staff, please use the question and answer box at the bottom of your screen. And please see the chat box for resources that will be mentioned throughout today's presentation. We'll post links there. We've set aside time at the end for questions from the audience, so please submit your questions to the question and answer box as well. We'll answer as many as we can, and if we have overflow questions, we'll try to follow up with an email. Thank you for being here. Finally, this webinar will be recorded and posted to our YouTube channel, so you can view it again. We have three great presentations from people who are working in our region to plan and build complete streets and who understand the safety benefits of good street design. It brings me great pleasure to introduce our panelists today. Tim Gustafson is an Associate Vice President and Senior Planner at Epstein, a design and engineering company. With 15 years of experience in bicycle and pedestrian planning, his work involves complete streets design and technical assistance services, including feasibility and traffic studies, long-range municipal, regional, and comprehensive planning, Phase 1 and Phase 2 engineering. He is an instructor for the National Highway Institute and a certified trainer for the National Association of City Transportation Officials. Carlos Feliciano is the IDOT in-house project and environmental studies unit head. He is also the district ADA and bicycle coordinator. Carlos has 19 years of experience with IDOT focused on preliminary engineering and environmental studies, covered by the Federal National Environmental Policy Act for bridges and intersection improvements, as well as bicycle and pedestrian accessibility. Carlos has been ADA coordinator since 2015 and bicycle coordinator since 2017 in IDOT's District 1 located in northeastern Illinois, which includes state highways in the Chicago area and surrounding collar counties of Cook, Lake, McHenry, Will, DuPage, and Kane counties. Our final presenter for today is Rupa Anjanappa. Rupa works as a transportation engineer for the city of Aurora. She has been with the city for 7 years, working mainly on traffic and transportation-related projects. Key experience includes conducting Phase 1 and Phase 2 engineering studies for various roadway, bicycle, and pedestrian projects that use federal and local funding, as well as traffic modeling. She is the bike share program coordinator for the city and also a liaison to the city's Bicycle, Pedestrian, and Transit Advisory Board. Thank you all for joining us. We look forward to your presentations. Before we hear from our presenters, I'm going to set the stage with a brief presentation about CMAP's new safety action agenda and an introduction to complete streets. So if you've had time and energy to look just beyond the major headlines lately, you may have noticed that we have the beginnings of a traffic safety epidemic in our country. These are just a few of the recent headlines, but the numbers are troubling. Over the last decade, the United States has seen an increase of 45% in the number of pedestrians who are struck and killed by drivers. We have seen the number of speed-related crashes increase and crashes becoming more severe, meaning a higher percentage of them are resulting in fatalities. Many of these trends were exacerbated by the pandemic as stay-at-home orders emptied our wide roads and allowed for what is referred to as aggressive or excessive speeding. As a result, in Illinois alone, we saw traffic fatalities increase almost 16% between 2019 and 2020. Next slide, please. But the reality is that these trends have been alarming for a while. In northeastern Illinois, averaged annual traffic fatalities began to tick upwards in 2014, as seen by the orange line here on this graph, which is about the same year that we saw an upward trend in the number of fatalities and serious injuries among bicyclists and pedestrians. This means that a growing number of our regional traffic fatalities are pedestrians and bicyclists. As more people desire to walk and bicycle and eventually return to transit, it is critical to provide infrastructure that keeps them safe. Next slide, please. In response to these alarming trends, CMAP has recently started a safety action agenda, which is a multi-year effort to develop research and programs that will help make our region safer for all types of travelers, but especially for bicyclists and pedestrians, who are sometimes called vulnerable modes, meaning they are not protected by a vehicle shell, and they are highly vulnerable to traffic safety risks, especially how fast cars are driving. Next slide, please. I want to share a compelling visual with you about speeds and pedestrian safety. Here you can see that the speed of a vehicle has a profound impact on whether a pedestrian survives a crash. If a vehicle is traveling at 20 miles per hour and strikes a pedestrian, 90% of pedestrians will survive that crash. And as the vehicle approaches 30 miles per hour, the chance of surviving drops to 60%. A pedestrian only has a 20% chance of surviving a crash with a car going 40 miles per hour. There are a lot of implications of this information, but the primary takeaway today is that high speeds and pedestrian activity is a deadly combination. Next slide, please. As CMAP starts to think about traffic safety, there are a lot of dimensions to consider. You can see them all listed here on this graphic. These are referred to as the E's of transportation safety. You can see how broad and complex safety is. We hope to get into many of these topics in the future, in future CMAP Talks events, but today we're focusing on engineering or design. That refers to ways in which our infrastructure and features of our street look and function to support safety. Next slide, please. Which brings us to our topic today, complete streets. Complete streets is a transportation policy and design approach that requires streets to be planned, designed, operated, and maintained to enable safe, convenient, and comfortable travel and access for all anticipated roadway users, regardless of their age, abilities, or mode of travel. This is a significant shift in paradigm from traditional traffic planning and engineering principles that focus primarily on moving as many vehicles as possible, as fast as possible, without congestion. Next slide, please. Complete streets improve safety by supporting desired behaviors, like providing convenient and clear crosswalks to support predictable crossings, by providing accommodation for bicycles that reduce conflicts with vehicles, and by creating a roadway with what we refer to as visual friction that can signal to drivers that they should slow down. Indeed, you will drive much differently on a street that looks like this. Next slide, please. Versus a street that looks like this, which has been built with very little thought for pedestrian and bicycle movement and supports higher speeds. Again, next slide, please. You'll drive much differently on a street like this that prioritizes movement in downtown areas, for example, by pedestrians and bicyclists, than you would drive on a street that looks like, next slide, please, this, which has again been built for speed and efficiency of vehicles. When streets are designed well, they support and encourage desired behaviors, which can reduce the need for enforcement activities to ensure safety. So with that introduction to complete streets, I'm happy to pass things over to Tim Gustafson with Epstein.
All right. Well, thank you, Vicki, and good morning, everybody. It's great to be here, and I was asked. I see a lot of familiar names in the attendees list, so I'm excited to present here. When I was asked to present, I I was excited because the conversation surrounding complete streets has definitely taken on a lot of new energy regarding what we have the ability to do. And so what I'd like to do, next slide, please, is I'd like to focus today on my presentation about kind of the design of complete streets and all of the host of things that come along with it. One of the things that you may have experienced in being part of conversations for complete streets is not just the plan, but wanting to get the project in. There's also a whole host of things that happen around and during this process that I think are really important. And the reason I wanted to mention that is because some of these things don't need to get lost in the cracks, and they don't need to fall apart between phases of project's implementation. So next slide, please. Whenever I was looking at scopes of work that I've been involved in or projects that I've been following along with, I kind of noticed there are a lot of things that show up in different stages of a project. So if you're looking at this from left to right, I mean, if you think about the vision that we share for having complete streets, one of the first things that we say we need to do is, well, let's get a plan together. Let's get implementation strategies and figure out what we want to do. We're also really focused on the design and the construction of those facilities. I mean, when we've been able to transform our environments, we can truly make them memorable places. But above and below this continuum that I've shown on here are kind of some words that show up in the process all the time. So the first thing that always comes from, more often than not, elected officials is, well, how are we going to pay for it? So funding is always a concern. And even if we come into the process and we're providing technical assistance, we're only there for a short period of time. We want to form a long-term relationship with these agencies and with all of you, but there's also a need for some capacity building. So as Vicki mentioned when she was talking about my background, sometimes providing that training and that education is really important just so people are speaking the same language. I've always said that you don't necessarily need to be the one doing the drafting or doing the design to be part of the design process. So I like to inspire people to have opinions and have those educated understandings for what's possible. So I'll get into a little bit of that today with the slides that I've assembled. And then a lot of the other things that you'll see is that engagement and coordination have to happen throughout every phase. So I'll talk a little bit about that in each of these examples. And then you get to enjoy these facilities, but there's this ongoing support and need for marketing, selling the idea. I think we've made great strides in how to get people on board with complete streets. And I'll talk about a couple of examples for how we've done that and the work that we do around complete streets. So let's go to the next slide, please. I wanted to show this. I have to admit, I thought my favorite color was green, but as evidence on this screen, apparently that's not true when assembling reports. When it comes to implementing complete streets, there is actually no one size fits all. A multimodal plan is a very important component. A transportation and comprehensive plans are very important. But here on the screen are just a couple of examples of how those kind of take different pathways to completion. And I'll talk about some of these in greater detail, but going from left to right, I wanted to start first by talking about the Lake Calumet Trail feasibility study, which is just wrapping up. There's a need for connecting facilities east and west of the Illinois International Port District. And one of the best ways through there and providing access is actually through the use of a trail. And so working with the city of Chicago and the Port District and IDOT, we identified connections that needed to be made so that the southeast side neighborhoods in the city of Chicago have access to and across Lake Calumet. This draws in access from people in the southeast side that don't have a direct connection without having to cross the Bishop Ford. So these are really important connections that need to be made. And this was just the first step in a long time of conversation. So if you think about that continuum I mentioned, the vision had been there for a long time, but stakeholders needed to know, how would that actually happen? How would this connection be made and what might it look like? And how much would something like that cost? So those are all important connections that you may not be able to get out of a complete streets plan, but there's always this next step that sometimes needs to happen so that people understand what they're getting themselves into in terms of a project and inspiring people about what might be possible. Up on the top of the image, the Northern Lakeshore Trail Connectivity Plan, that was recently completed by CMAP. And this was actually a 5-municipality effort that also involved Illinois Beach State Park, which is managed and owned by the Illinois Department of Natural Resources. This was an area where a lot of these municipalities loved complete streets and wanted to have access to the lakefront, but they don't have jurisdiction over the largest share of that lakefront. So this partnership was a truly important way of helping to remove barriers, identify projects that could help close some of those gaps. And I'm excited to say that one of the municipalities and IDNR are already in the process of implementing this to close some gaps, some as small as just the last 300 feet before you get to the state line. Down below that, the city of Warrenville, they were in a different path. They had a complete streets policy, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, but they needed a little bit more custom assistance to get to the next stage. And then the last image here on the right is a project that's just wrapping up in the village of Northbrook. There are 2 IDOT owned rights of way that are within the village that they'd like to improve, but since they don't have jurisdiction over those facilities, they wanted to take a first glance to figure out what would be involved in getting side paths constructed within the right of way within the village to truly help them implement a portion of their bicycle and pedestrian plan. So complete streets implementation takes on a couple of different flavors, and I'm going to go into a few more examples of some of the recent work that dives into that. So the first here is City of La Crosse. This goes back a few years yet. And this was an interesting one because the complete streets and the bicycle and pedestrian plan had just been completed, and we were still working with them to assist them on implementing the first few recommendations. In that time, they had also passed the stormwater utility ordinance, which allowed them to create a funding stream to actually improve stormwater management. And the way that they went about this is it created a fund whereby they could do things like pedestrian curb extensions, and they put biocells and stormwater management best practices in them. So when they approach homeowners with the idea of a bike boulevard or a neighborhood greenway, it was actually proposed as this is actually going to reduce flooding in the neighborhood. It also happens to benefit us as a city for implementing complete streets. So this was an area where it's actually the stormwater needs drove the need for closing these corridors and rebuilding them as complete streets environments. So this was an area where even if you're involved in complete streets from a bicycle and pedestrian perspective, you don't want to be afraid to get involved in discussions regarding stormwater or drainage because there could be potential benefits there. And as I mentioned here, that allowed them to create a funding source as well. So now we're not drawing down from the general budget, but rather the stormwater utility ordinance to put in curb extensions was a great way to get that double benefit. And if homeowners were willing to install some additional stuff on their own property, they would get a credit that would draw down the amount that they would have to pay. So this was an area where we even saw the conservative-minded approach was pushing people to embrace complete streets. And I wanted to offer that as an example because it's not necessarily the place you might look to find advocates and supporters for complete streets. So let's go to the next slide. So this is a project that we're currently working on in the city of Decatur. One of the things that Vicki touched on was that there's a desire and a demand for complete streets. But when you look at this, sometimes there's a little bit of a mismatch. So I called this slide the stress level mismatch. For those of you who have been familiar with the concept of level of traffic stress, it's a method that is used to evaluate a roadway from the perspective of what a bicyclist would feel when traveling along it. And it's based on speed, separation from traffic, and volume from traffic. And so as you can see on the left side, when analyzing the city of Decatur's roadway network, identified that about 10% of their street network was comfortable, or what we would consider low level of traffic stress 1. And then seeing the blue, yellow, and red, the higher stress roadways comprise a larger share of the roadway network. Now, if you contrast that with the pie chart on the right, when asking people how they identify as a prospective or an actual bicyclist, about a third of the population doesn't even get on a bicycle. So the amount of stress is not even relevant in the conversation for wanting to provide comfortable environments for them. And then only 7% of the strong and fearless bicyclists would actually identify as bicycling in the city as well. So 40% of our roadways in Decatur are super stressful, and they would only be ridden by about 7% of the prospective bicycling population in that city. So we definitely see that there's a mismatch between what we have and how we identify. And our interest is helping to make each of these pie charts look a lot more similar. Ideally, we'd like the pie chart on the right to change. We don't, and on the left, to be fair, because we don't want all of our roadways to be stressful. So this is an example where just telling the marketing story about how to change people's comfort and safety really drives them to be more in support of saying, yes, I actually do think some of our roadways can change. So next slide, please. So this was the Warrenville example that I touched on earlier. And this one is interesting because they have a complete streets ordinance, and we were asked to help them craft the ordinance But as part of that, they also needed to have a little bit of technical assistance because they wanted to make the case to City Council of saying, well, this is all well and good, but how much is embracing complete streets going to cost us? And that's a question we field a lot. That's something that I think is very important to ask, and it comes up often. But the Public Works Director actually had a very clever way of saying, well, here's how I want to address this. I would like to take a look at our entire network, and I'd like to analyze whether it has sidewalks or side paths on it, if we have jurisdiction over it, and what it would take to actually retrofit our system in order to provide all the sidewalks we need and implement side paths where our trails plan, and what would that take in order for us to get there. So this is a very high level exercise. I'm going to get into more detail on the Northbrook example in a bit, but they wanted to make the case for saying, okay, we're going to embrace this, and we want to make sure that we have funding set aside. So after identifying what that overall cost would be, and I know I don't have it on the slide here, but it was more about process. Then the Public Works Director was going to begin the process of saying, I'd like to set aside our ability to provide local match when DuPage County comes to us, when the Forest Preserve or the Tollway comes to us, or when IDOT comes to us, so that we can participate in building out these complete streets. But he didn't want to have to go back to City Council for every independent action to engage. So by having the ability to implement complete streets, this was able to improve overall city operations and efficiency. And that's not something that's necessarily even rooted in design either. So when you're thinking about what your city or what your community needs as far as getting over that hump of complete streets, it may also be how council interacts with staff at the village or city level. So this was an example where I considered it a complete streets policy plus, because sometimes you need that plus in order to get people on board. So let's go to the next slide, please. Now, Carlos is going to get into design a little bit more, and some of you may have seen me give presentations on design, so I don't want to spend too much time on it. But the general idea, like I said at the top of the call, was I don't want you to feel like you don't get to have opinions on design just because you're not doing the actual design work. So in some of my design trainings, I walk people through this idea to say, you got an idea. Who's in charge of governing that design? You'll see a whole bunch of design guidelines that are out there. They tend to be a little bit dizzying as far as the amount that are there. But as long as you know how to navigate those, you can find out whether or not the idea you have is allowed. And if it is allowed, what context is it allowed in? And that'll help you determine, can it be constructed and is it feasible? And once you get to that level on your decision tree, you look around to find out who's doing it best. And that's where some of the design guidelines are. That's where you'll see a lot of things coming out of Complete Streets Design Innovations. The image on the right is from the Northern Lakeshore Trail Connectivity Plan that says, you know, I like the idea of putting something in, but is it really appropriate for the speed or volume of traffic that I have on this roadway? And we wanted to come up with an option to give you just that really high level comfort of saying, yeah, this looks like it might be a good fit. And then you can get into that design in more detail. The image on the left at the bottom of the slide is more of an example of putting that idea into practice. Sometimes just drawing on an aerial can go a long way. And I know that that looks far more sophisticated, but sometimes this starts as a sketch on Google Maps. And you take it from that point and you move it into the next phase and you start talking about refining this. So don't be afraid to do that, because having those ideas and getting that conversation going is a really important part of getting people on board and embracing that. So next slide, please. Now, the village of Northbrook was a different situation. I have to admit that when we worked on the bicycle and pedestrian plan, they didn't have a policy yet in place, but they did have a bicycle task force, and they were interested in making sure that they were folding their projects from the bicycle plan into their capital improvement programming process. And one of the things that they looked to do after that was bring someone on who could help them just chip away at that plan. So task order by task order, this is a great way to say, okay, we have our complete streets policy, we have our multimodal plan. We just need someone to help us just get going and get that capacity. And not every village has full-time staff to do the design and implementation of these. So this is where the village of Northbrook kind of looked at it and said, you know, this is a cost-effective way of getting this going. So Epstein is assisting them on a variety of tasks to help them implement complete streets. And these are really minor. Sometimes it's just using their motor fuel tasks to do pavement marking improvements. Sometimes they need to put this out to bid for village funded improvements. The image you see here is actually going to be constructed either this month or next month, is the village's first neighborhood greenway is going in. although I have to admit it's very similar to the shared lane markings they already have on Cherry. This will be going in the Farnswood corridor, not too far from the villages downtown. So in this example, this is just providing them with really low cost solutions. These don't have to be massive projects, but if you have the ability to bring someone on to just do small specialized work, you can really start to get momentum and build that desire for those larger, more capital intensive projects. So sometimes starting small, I know a lot of people say, well, we can't transform all of our streets, so where do we even start? I would say start on the streets where you're already seeing, start on the streets where you've identified in your plan, and just do small segments. And when people see that it's been implemented, it makes things a little bit better. You really start to build that support and your network starts to fill itself in. So that's a good example of just kind of chipping away at the design, and you don't necessarily have to do a massive project to do that. Next slide, please. And then I wanted to finish on this slide, which doesn't have anything other than a whole bunch of imagery. And the reason I wanted to show this is because one of the ways to truly build that enthusiasm and desire for complete streets is to show people what things might look like. And we do this on a sophisticated level, like the images show on the right, but we still use very basic entry-level, easy to operate tools. If anybody has ever seen an image like this and you've used it before, you know what I'm talking about. But if you're just seeing something like this for the first time, the exciting thing is this is available online. I'll actually put this in the chat here after our discussion today, but there's a website out there called StreetMix that allows you to drag and drop complete streets elements like they were building blocks on a page. You do not need to be an expert or a designer because they will tell you how wide these facilities normally are or should be. I even have opinions on how much narrower certain roadway lanes can be. But this is a great tool to just say, you know, I just want to put my ideas on the page. I want to get this stuff going. And we're not already there to do the design or the implementation, but I have some opinions and I want to share them with the world. So images on the right are a little bit more refined when you get into a planning process. But the reason we like to do these as part of feasibility studies or plans is this is what's really going to get people excited about what something could look like. So, you know, take it anywhere from the entry-level images on the left to the professionally developed renderings on the right. Anywhere along that spectrum, you can be part of that complete streets conversation because this is your greatest asset. So with that, I'm going to take it to the next slide and thank everybody for letting me present this morning. And I'm going to turn it over to the next presenter.
Great, and I will welcome Carlos, who I believe is access. Excellent.
Can you hear me okay?
Sounds great. Thanks, Carlos.
Okay. So let me see if I can advance the slide. All right, so as Vicky had mentioned, my name is Carlos Feliciano. I'm the IDOT unit head for the in-house project and environmental studies unit, dealing with intersection improvements and bridge improvements. But as a side gig, I also double as the district's, one of the district's ADA coordinators and the bicycle coordinator. So today's presentation will talk about IDOT and complete streets and how it relates to safety. We'll be talking about safety needs and trends that Vicky had pointed out at the beginning, as well as bicyclist, pedestrian, and education in the realm of safety. All right, so the picture that you see right now is the latest trends from IDOT's website as to the number of fatalities in the state of Illinois. And you can start seeing that as of 2015, we were hitting below the 1,000 fatality mark, which is a goal that we had always had. But you can see that starting 2016, that trend starts to go up. So IDOT invested a lot of resources when in the realm of engineering, education, enforcement, and campaigns to try to move the needle of the number of fatalities in the state to go down. And we're heading in the right direction, as you can see in the graph. So when you're looking at state highways, you can see that on state routes and US routes, that trend is going down. But one thing that IDOT does have a concern about is that when you look at city streets, which are municipal streets, So the trend for the local road system is starting to go up, and that's something that's of concern to us, because we, as a state, do not have as much control as on the local system as to what locals do to improve safety on their end. So our role becomes more of an advisory role. Another trend that you start to see is, after around the 2000 era, you start seeing that the number of fatalities inside vehicles is decreasing, and that's due to improvements in safety because of the vehicular design. But one concerning trend that you start to see is that now external fatalities, meaning pedestrians and bicyclists, are starting to go up. This is according to the NHTSA fatality analysis reporting system. So that is a trend that we start seeing after the beginning of the 2000s. So the challenge for IDOT has always been, how do we balance safety versus providing access? IDOT's highway network, especially in the northeastern Illinois area, is pretty robust. We have somewhere around 3,000 miles of highway. So it does become very convenient for that network to be utilized, an attractive system for bicycle and pedestrian accommodations. However, we do have to balance that with the need for movement of commercial vehicles, movement of people in their daily commute, and how do we balance those two needs? So what you see here, it's IDOT's facility design selection table. This was updated in 2019. And it was updated because we had a lot of demand for facilities in IDOT's system. IDOT, in our district, the preference is to install a shared use path off the road in order to provide accommodations for bicyclists. So, however, there is a maintenance and cost component to that facility. So IDOT updated its facility design selection table to now have the off-road shared use path selected in any context, whether it's a high-speed or a low-speed environment, based on that local coordination that we do as part of our engineering studies. But what you see in the selection table is that all of these accommodations do not require a cost participation from that municipality. All of these accommodations are on-road facilities that are applicable depending on the speeds, context of the roadway, whether it's urban, suburban, or rural, as well as traffic volumes. So these are the facilities that are included on the state system, which are paved shoulders with and without rumble strips. Rumble strips are intended to alert drivers when they're swerving off of the roadway. So they have a proven safety countermeasure for improving safety and reducing fatalities on the state highways. Now you can see in the picture on the right that we do have a facility that provides for, when we do have small shoulders, we still want to provide a bicycle accommodation within that shoulder and still maintain those rumble strips. So we have a design that accommodates a 3-foot space for the bicyclists to be able to ride on, while at the same time providing the vehicular safety. Shared lane markings, there's inclusion after our 2019 update of the Bureau of Design and Environment Manual for shared lane markings in low-speed urban environments in accordance with the MUTCD guidelines. Conventional and buffered bike lanes have always been in IDOT's facility design. However, now we have additional improvements to buffers and minimum requirements for buffering, as well as two-way facilities to provide a two-way accommodations. Road diets have also been in IDOT's design selection guidelines, but there's additional information that was added in 2019 to provide guidance as to how to provide accommodations for bicyclists within these road diets. Bridge and culvert accommodations, we have numerous bridges, so we do provide guidance in there for the design of these facilities and these structures. And separated bike lanes was added in 2019. So these are facilities that are protected from the vehicular traffic while still providing an on-road component separate from the pedestrian. Clybourne Avenue is the first installation of a separated bike lane in the city of Chicago, which is a partnership that IDOT had with CDOT. So from north to division, we installed a separated bike lane. Raised cycle tracks are Chapter 17 does not provide design details for how to design these raised cycle track facilities. However, in 2020, we did update the chapter to include the inclusion of these facilities on the state system. There are guides from other states that we're looking at, so I expect that in the future there will be some design guidance added for raised cycle tracks, but they are a component of the system in northeastern Illinois. And intersection treatments is a big focus of, I apologize. Intersection treatments are a big focus of IDOT's implementation strategy for bicyclists, because the majority of the fatalities and crashes that happen with bicycles are at the intersection. So we provide a robust number of options for bicyclist accommodations at intersections. And then the last thing that we've added in the 2019 update is bike signals. These are signals intended exclusively for bicyclists when there's conflicts with vehicular turning movements. So 4 of these treatments that we added in 2019 are under MUTCD interim approvals, which are bike boxes, turn boxes, green pavement markings, and bike signals. However, there is a notice for proposed amendments going on right now with the MUTCD. So these accommodations are expected to be included in the MUTCD in the near future. These are the guides that we use to inform our facilities. So one of the things that we start seeing is that on the cyclist trend, you can see that the number of fatalities for cyclists in the state of Illinois is actually going down, which is a trend that we want to see. It's something that we want to continue to see. And you can see that as a matter of a proportion of fatalities, the number of bicyclist fatalities is pretty low compared to the other modes. One trend that you do have concern is that now you see an increase in pedestrian fatalities. So what is IDOT doing to address pedestrian fatalities? So IDOT partnered with the Federal Highway Administration as part of the Everyday Counts federal initiative, which is an initiative to provide and deploy proven underutilized innovations to improve pedestrian safety. And there's different implementation stages, which I'll cover in each of the strategies that we're using. So IDOT looked at 7 different alternatives. I don't know why they call it Spectacular 7. It's like John and K plus 8 minus John. So we'll go with that. So the first one is leading pedestrian intervals. So these are signal phasing modifications to improve the visibility of pedestrians crossing at an intersection. So here IDOT is in its demonstration stages. We do follow the guidelines for implementation. However, there are very few locations where LPIs are being implemented. This year in 2021, IDOT actually released the new LPI guidelines by our Central Office Operations Bureau to provide guidance to our engineers as to where is it appropriate and what different treatments are needed to be included for provisions for lead pedestrian intervals. The second treatment is crossing visibility enhancement. Now, in this stage, we are in the assessment stage. IDOT developed an uncontrolled crossing guidelines, which provide improved signage as well as pavement markings. Now, crossing visibility enhancements can reduce pedestrian crashes by 23 to 48%. So those are good numbers to see for these uncontrolled crossings. This is what the matrix for the uncontrolled crossings guidelines looks like, and it's based on the roadway's traffic volume, speed, and the context, the number of lanes, and typography. Currently, we are in the first version of this matrix. Version 2.0 is in draft mode at IDOT, and it should be released pretty soon. So before, IDOT relied just on engineering judgment to help them decide whether or not an uncontrolled crossing was warranted and appropriate. Now we're utilizing these guides that help us to make informed decisions. The third treatment is rectangular rapid flashing beacons, or RFBs. Here, IDOT is in the demonstration phase. These can reduce pedestrian crashes by up to 47%, according to the USDOT. Many of you are familiar with RFBs. One thing, there used to be a moratorium on RFBs. However, there are no longer any moratoriums on RFBs at IDOT or on the state highways, but they do have to meet the requirements and appropriateness. Now, although RFBs can be installed on 2-lane and multi-lane roadways, the performance on multi-lane roadways needs consideration because they don't perform as well as in 2-lane highways. The next treatment is pedestrian refuge islands in mid-block crossings. They can reduce crashes by 32%. You can see that we do utilize pedestrian refuge islands in locations, and as part of the uncontrolled crossings guidelines, we do provide guidance as to what do the signage that is required for the installation of these, as well as the type of striping and improvement in visibility. So by skewing the pedestrian refuge islands, you're able to direct pedestrians to have a clear visual of the oncoming vehicles so that they can make informed and safer decisions. The next treatment, this is what the different treatments that's recommended by the uncontrolled crossings guideline looks like. Treatment 1, which is just the standard pedestrian crossing signs. Treatment 2 adds the beacons. Treatment 3 adds the stop bars and stop here for pedestrians crossing the roadway, which is a law in the state of Illinois. Treatment 4, which is the RFB, and treatment 5, which is either a pedestrian traffic signal or a pedestrian hybrid beacon, which I'll get into next. That's our 5th treatment, would be pedestrian hybrid beacons. These are shown to reduce crashes by 55%, and NCHRP report 562 shows driver compliance above 95%. So IDOT is currently in the development stages for incorporation of pedestrian hybrid beacons. And the reason why we're in that stage is because few of the proposal locations where these have been requested meet the actual MUTCD criteria, which is what IDOT uses for the installation of pedestrian hybrid beacons. As such, the preference for our district in the northeastern Illinois area is for pedestrian traffic signals. The reason why we have that preference is because we have over 3,000 traffic signals in our northeastern Illinois area, in the Chicagoland area. And many of these are actually part of an interconnected system that we can benefit for our improved mobility through our network. They also provide driver familiarity, whereas pedestrian hybrid beacons are fairly new in the state of Illinois. Everybody knows how to use a traffic signal, and everybody knows how to push a button and what their next steps are. And they also provide simplified maintenance. So that way, when our signal is down, we're able to repair it and fix it and get people moving as quickly as possible. The next treatment is road diets. IDOT is in demonstration phase for these. We have several locations we have installed or improved roads to have a road diet, which is a reduction of the number of lanes based on reductions in traffic volumes. These are proven to reduce crashes by 19 to 47%. Here's an example of a road diet that was done on Jackson Street between Ogden and Halsted in the city of Chicago. And you can see, large 3 lanes, large in a single direction. And with road diet improvements, you're able to provide a complete street facility that accommodates parking, bicyclists, as well as a buffered bike lane and room for vehicles to be able to access their destinations. The next example is in Geneva. We have Illinois 31, where you can see that there's an undivided 4-lane highway, and that was able to be improved to provide a 3-lane section with 2-way left turn lanes to access to the various different residences throughout this corridor. Now, the key thing to know and understand about road diets is that road diets require project development to be performed. So we do require an engineering study to ensure what the effects to the operations and the safety of that modification, what effect does it have to the system. So it does have to go through IDOT's project development process, which is a 3-phase approach. Phase 1 is the engineering studies, then we prepare the contract plans in phase 2, and phase 3 is the actual construction. And the thing to know about these is that it takes time, because you do have to have a lot of engineering analysis done to make sure that we're not making things worse by reducing the number of lanes that are out there. And it requires coordination with the public. It requires public outreach to make sure that people are aware that their commute, their daily operations are going to be different. The next treatment are raised crosswalks. Here, IDOT evaluated the inclusion of raised crosswalks in the state system, and IDOT decided not to implement raised crosswalks. These are more appropriate in a local system. They provide a lot of issues with snow plowing, which are a concern in the state of Illinois, especially in the northeastern area. You do have to pay special attention to drainage to make sure that it's draining properly. And you have to pay special attention on curved roadways. The next treatment is the everyday counts countermeasure selector. So for municipalities that are struggling with how to reduce pedestrian crashes in their system, there's some resources out there that are available for you to be able to select based on your context what would be the appropriate treatment if you're not using IDOT's uncontrolled crossings guide. So engineering is not the only solution, however, as Vicky has pointed out, there are 6 different E's in the equation for improved safety, and education has to be part of the equation. You can see here, the graph shows the compliance with occupant restraint, meaning seatbelts. You can see that with education and enforcement, you can significantly increase the compliance rate for seatbelt usage. And right now, the state of Illinois is up to 94% compliance. Now, you see that those trends started going on in 2001, which is the same year that the number of fatalities in vehicles started to go down. So there is a correlation between the two. So there are numerous campaigns that IDOT has. You know, bicycle and pedestrians are a component of our safety campaigns, but there's also, you know, seatbelts usage, motorcycles, wearing your helmets for motorcycles, as well as work zone awareness. Because we have been seeing an increase in work zone fatalities. It's something that is concerning. Next week is actually National Work Zone Awareness Week. Education has to be a component for each municipality to educate their citizenry as to how to properly use these facilities. Having a safety action plan, having a pedestrian plan is always beneficial. That way you are not always being reactive. You can be more proactive as to how to improve safety within your local system. There are numerous resources out there that are available for you. The Federal Highways has a really good website for pedestrian and bicycle safety as part of their Safe Transportation for Every Pedestrian program, or the STEP program. Lastly, I wanted to give a nod to our bicycle and pedestrian accommodation study. So for all of these facilities that we're talking about, as well as other ones that are not included in IDOT's bicycle facility designs, IDOT prepared a bicycle and pedestrian accommodation study that studies different bicycle and pedestrian facilities and how these affect operations, maintenance, and safety. So it gives you a pretty nice conglomerate of the research available at the time of the publication of this document that provides a description of the facility, a picture of what the facility would look like, and then the benefits and considerations when it relates to the tenants that IDOT looks for, which are safety, operations, and maintenance. So it provides a matrix for you to be able to see where is it appropriate to install some of these facilities. This is another education component that IDOT provides. It's available on IDOT's website, and I believe Jane was going to put a link to it on the chat. So with that, thank you very much, and I will pass it on, give up control.
Thank you, Carlos. And welcome, Rupa.
Hey, Vicky. Can you hear me?
You sound great.
All right. Good morning, everybody. I want to start by thanking CMAP for these educational sessions and also for the opportunity to be a panelist. Today, I intend to provide a brief overview of Complete Streets policy that the city has adopted and few project examples that focuses on improving safety and accessibility for all road users. Next slide, please. City of Aurora adopted Complete Streets policy in December 2020, and the vision is to create a reliable, livable, safe, and accessible, well-connected surface transportation network for all users, including people of all ages and abilities. City had been implementing some of the complete streets principles into its planning, scoping, design, and construction even before adopting the policy. However, adopting the policy ensures that the policy principles are incorporated into all the appropriate plans, manuals, programs, etc., across various relevant city departments. The city plans to measure the performance by keeping a note on the pedestrian, transit, and ADA accommodations that we are making, including the bicycle facilities, which are both on-street and off-street, on a yearly basis or so. Next slide. Having a bicycle pedestrian plan is integral to the principles of complete streets. The plan recognizes areas and aspects within the existing roadway network to encourage alternative mode of transport to motor vehicles. As you can see, there are proposed bikeway network improvements throughout the city. Some of these projects have been completed while some of these are still in the planning stage. The city is also recognized as the bicycle-friendly community at the bronze level by the League of American Bicyclists, and the recognition came back in 2016. We are up for a renewal and we're hoping for a silver status, but continuing with the bronze level status would also be good. What this would do is it just adds a continued value to all the work being done to encourage alternative mode of transportation. Next slide, please. River Street corridor improvements that we did back in 2015 is a great example that showcases how a street can serve all road users. The street was under state's jurisdiction and part of one-way coupling. City took over the jurisdiction from state and converted River Street to a two-way street and added a protected bike lane on the south side that runs about half a mile between Downers Place and North Avenue. The two-way protected bike lane fills the decade or so long Fox River Trail gap, thus providing a continuous ride for bicyclists. The protected bike lane was extended as part of another project up to the Prairie Street. We are hoping to improve the rest of the corridor through another project that is being prepared for a 2021 HSIP grant. Next slide, please. Farnsworth Avenue. We are excited about improving this segment. The project has secured HSIP funding in 2019 and is currently under the phase 1 engineering. The intersection is recognized as top 5% critical in the IDOT safety tier and has seen 2 fatal crashes in the past 5 or 10 years. There were safety concerns at both the Illinois Prairie Path crossing and the Marshall Boulevard crossing. To address the safety concerns, we are adding the pedestrian refuge islands, rectangular rapid flashing beacons, advanced warning signs, resurfacing this whole segment and restriping, and limiting the parking lot entry at the Illinois Prairie Path crossing to right in and right out only. This should help grab motorists' attention to the pedestrians and the bicyclists attempting to cross the road. Next slide, please. Indian Trail Corridor has secured 2 types of funding: HSIP funding for the Indian at High Street intersection and the STP local funding for the rest of the corridor. Safety concerns were raised in crossing the Indian Trail at High Street, where Illinois Prairie Path meets. We are addressing these concerns by proposing a new traffic signal at the Indian and High Street intersection, widening the roads of the corridor from 4 lanes to 5 lanes to bring conformity and provide additional capacity via intersection channelization. We are also extending the bike path on the north side to meet Mitchell and Church for better connectivity and safe crossing. Next slide, please. This slide and the next slide shows the improvements City has made to Aurora Transportation Center. The project has received federal funding, CMAP funding, and is a classical example depicting improvements that caters to not only the motorists, but also the public transportation users, pedestrians, bicyclists, and also for people with disabilities. The improvements include reconfiguration of the ATC parking lot, relocating of the PACE staging area. The staging area has been moved from, it was based at the Broadway, close to the Broadway Avenue. It has been moved closer to the railway tracks so people can off and on the metro station. There is a kiss and ride area, taxi drop-off area, a new 10 feet wide sidewalk on the west side of Broadway Avenue. Lighting improvements have been made on Broadway Avenue and in the parking lot. Of course, a new traffic signal at the ATC entrance, ADA parking, pedestrian walkway, and the jewel in the crown, the ATC pedestrian bridge. We can move on to the next slide. As you can see, this is a drone image that was probably taken earlier this year, probably in March. This pedestrian bridge is about 750 feet in length and connects the west side of Aurora to the east side over the Fox River. It also connects the Fox River Trail on the west side to the Fox River Trail on the east side and provides a direct access to the ATC station, as you can see in the picture. We are hoping to open the bridge to the public somewhere in the end of May, but that's tentative depending on the weather. There is still some amount of work that needs to be done, but we are really excited about this project. Next slide, please. Last but not the least, we are addressing safety concerns and making immediate improvements through our citywide resurfacing and sidewalk programs. When the list is prepared for the resurfacing or the sidewalk program, the list will be shared with the Bicycle Pedestrian Transit Advisory members for their valuable inputs, which is incorporated into construction, provided they fall within the program criteria. As an example, I've stated Gale Street improvements. Gale Street improvements, it's looking at providing the on-street bikeway facilities, and we were really grateful that we could incorporate this project into the citywide resurfacing project for this year. Sidewalk program is a resident complaint driven and basically fixes the damaged sidewalks and also looks at making ADA improvements. All of these improvements would definitely add safety and probably provide better accessibility as well. This concludes my presentation and thank you for your time. With this, I hand it over to Vicky.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Rupa. Thank you to all our panelists for sharing your work with us. We saw that our agenda was very packed and we were able to answer a lot of the questions in the Q&A box by typing them live, which please see the answered questions. Thank you to our panelists for doing that on the fly. There was one question, and I think it's an important topic to talk about just very quickly before we sign off, and that's this idea that this last year, our streets have taken on new importance in our cities. They're a huge physical part of our public space in our cities, and we're seeing people experiment with using them in different ways. We're like outdoor dining and expanded areas for walking and bicycling. So I do feel like there's a moment of opportunity here as communities desire to experiment with the highest and best use of these streets. I wonder if our panelists want to speak a little bit to the other benefits of complete streets. We've talked a lot about the safety benefits today, but there are a lot of other ways in which complete streets support our communities. Do you have thoughts about other important outcomes that you've seen?
So Vicky, I could speak quickly to that, especially as you mentioned, because people are attempting to use streets for things other than transportation, and it's being embraced by a larger audience. The city of Chicago has a design competition open to reach out to communities and come up with creative ideas for outdoor dining space that may allow them to move towards a more permanent installation. So I live in the Rogers Park neighborhood, and our Chamber of Commerce has been very active at trying to get those ideas going to allow people to use those spaces in a more flexible, semi-permanent to permanent manner. So the restaurant and retail industry is now starting to see the benefits of using complete streets in a way other than they had seen before.
Great, thank you. And with that, we've hit the top of the hour. I want to thank our panelists, Carlos Feliciano with IDOT, Tim Gustafson with Epstein, and Rupa Anjanappa with the City of Aurora. Thank you to everyone who joined us today, both here at the webinar and on Facebook. We will be in touch. We will make copies available of the presentation to attendees in today's webinar. And please look for a survey to respond about the webinar, And we look forward to seeing you at the next CMAP talks. Thank you everyone for attending.